Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 133. Scott. Due to the nature of what they were doing, they actually ran the Sentinel simulation about a dozen times. Fortunately, the Sentinel being what it wasn't a particularly difficult or draining scenario, which was part of why Scott had chosen that particular scenario. They could ante up to something that gave them a workout next time. The two teams had a lot of folks who were capable of at least short bursts of aerial combat. 5 of them counted as aerial only as a technicality. They didn't actually fly, or at least not yet in one case. But they could intrude into flying airspace for a minute or two via various means, and do so with little to no warning. With that in mind, one of the biggest parts of the practices was getting all the aerial types working in concert. The Flyers and Technicals on the X-Men at least had some practice at working with one another, so there was a head start there. That said, from what Scott knew, there was little to no airtime working in concert with a fellow flying Avengers for the Avengers. Thor was the only one who had regularly had experience accounting for someone or thing else that flew, Avengers or not. Needless to say, the first attempt at having that lot all airborne at the same time and focused on the same target, sans Hulk, who was one of the technicals because he could and did jump into airspace to kick the crap out of targets, was rather chaotic at first. Not too surprisingly, it was Thor, the one with the most experience flying around, who managed to start getting everyone organized. This was one thing that neither Steve nor Scott could help all that much with, since neither of them flew. Scott had talked enough with Angel, the X-Man with the most experience flying, to know that there was a lot of stuff to keep track of up there compared to down on the ground. There was also a much larger number of possible maneuvers that could be performed. While Scott could fly the Blackbird, he never once had to fly it in combat conditions. Even if he had, the Blackbird and other man-made flying machines simply wasn't capable of the sorts of maneuvers the true flyers on the two teams could pull off, and Scott was used to thinking in terms of those more limited capabilities. Thor put himself and Storm on opposite sides of the Sentinel as far apart as they could get and still be in range to hit it, probably to give them both the widest field of fire as they traded control of lightning back and forth. Though for this scenario, they'd both be going through the motions without following through and producing full-scale lightning. Storm was fully capable of hitting the Sentinel with something that was roughly equivalent to a taser's charge. Thor, who evidently couldn't pull that sort of thing, would just let Mjolnir spark up to indicate an incipient hit. From the spark of interest in Thor's eyes when he found out what Storm was capable of, Scott was willing to bet Thor was going to try to learn to do smaller scale strikes. Scott suspected that thanks to any number of factors, it had never even occurred to Thor to try something other than a full power lightning blast until today. Similarly, Falcon and Angel got told to keep to one side of the robot, one to the front, one in the back, to minimize the chances they, with their wingspans, would cause each other problems. Tony was allowed to roam at will due to his ability via his computer and maneuverability to compensate for sudden arrivals in his airspace. The Technicals got told the same thing. Pick a side and stick with it in order to reduce the chaos, not to mention the number of people they had to watch out for up off the ground. With enough practice, they'd be able to go wherever they wanted, but for now, this was the best way to keep things from ending in tears. From there, it was a practice in figuring out how to work together. Not surprisingly, Iron Man worked best in tandem with Angel, whom he'd known for years and was friends with. Scott knew Iron Man wasn't used to working with more than one person at a time in a fight, and even that had only happened a couple of times, and quite recently. As smart as he was, he'd figured out how to work with a team pretty quick, but in the meantime, pairing him with a single person would work the best. While he didn't work with them as smoothly, Iron Man was also the only one, other than potentially Hulk, who wasn't there, who could fight near Storm and Thor with impunity when they were throwing lightning around. The rest of the Flyers, including Angel, all seemed to be able to mix and match with impunity after the initial chaos, which was excellent news. Of the Technicals, Jean and Loki were, well, near a disaster. Talk about your severe personality clashes. They'd spent more time giving each other looks that ranged from scornful to nearly homicidal and trading comments that drew blood than they had fighting. Other than that, the technical folks had been able to mix and match more or less at will. though Scott made due mental note that Nightcrawler and Spider-Man more or less didn't shut up the entire time they were paired up. In their case, it was often truly hilarious snark and sass about what they were fighting that didn't impair their ability to fight. Nightcrawler and Loki, on the other hand, utterly terrifying as a duo. Scott truly deeply pitied anyone the two of them worked together against because holy shit, both of them could teleport for one thing. Though interestingly, Nightcrawler could do it way faster than Loki could. Like with Thor, Scott was willing to bet Loki was going to figure out how to teleport repeatedly in under 15 seconds pretty quick, and that the only reason he didn't already know how was he'd never had the need to learn how to do so. It also turned out that Loki could shapeshift into some utterly terrifying flying beasties that Scott barely hoped he never saw for real, which had been a rather startling revelation. Scott did not envy Loki the grilling he'd get from the Avengers science geeks later over that subject. Both men were also unnervingly good with blades. The look on their faces when they realized this, and that their specific skill sets when it came to blades complemented each other, Nightcrawler with swords, Loki with daggers, especially throwing daggers, had not been comforting at all. And they were both of them very pragmatic and more willing to entertain lethal answers to the problem at hand than Scott was used to or approved of under normal circumstances, though he was willing to admit that alien invasions called for a lethal response. Slotting Hulk into the melee once he understood enough to truly work with a team rather than happening to be smashing in the general vicinity of people he was disinclined to smash was going to be interesting as all get out. Once the Flyers, technical and otherwise, had gotten themselves organized, everybody else jumped into the fight, including Scott. Again, due to the nature of the scenario, Scott ended up being the one calling the plays as he had more experience dealing with small-scale battles than Steve did. Steve was paying close attention to what Scott was doing, which the idea that Scott was teaching Captain America something wasn't flattering. At all. Nope, not a bit. It was quickly obvious that, Hulk aside, Black Widow and Hawkeye were the poorest at truly working with a team. Together, they were, if that was even possible, more terrifying than the Nightcrawler-Loki combo. They also could and did follow orders without argument unless they, especially Hawkeye, saw something that made the orders less than ideal. They could also work alongside other people. That said, neither one of them seemed able to trust anyone other than each other to have their backs, which was an integral part of true teamwork. Paired with anyone other than each other, they spent more time double and triple checking their surroundings and diverting themselves from their assigned targets in order to deal with a nearby one that might threaten them, but had been assigned to someone else to deal with, then was really wise in an all-out firefight. Not to mention had the near guarantee of causing them or another member of the team's grief. Scott knew the only fix for that was time. The next worst after the two of them was predictably Logan. Though in his case, Scott was sure it had more to do with the fact Logan sometimes lost his crap and didn't know friend from foe than anything else. Much as he and Logan sometimes rubbed each other the wrong way even now, Scott knew the man was aware of his problems enough and responsible enough to not want to run the risk of skewering an ally if he went feral. Nobody on the X-Men had been durable enough to not need to account for that. Logan had, in the month or so before Jean's freak-out, begun teaming up with a Nightcrawler, though. While Nightcrawler was no more durable than anyone else on the team, he had the ability to get clear of Logan in a split second if things went pear-shaped. Roughly half the Avengers, on the other hand, were either durable enough or could get out of the way really fast if Logan went feral, so it probably wouldn't be long before Logan started learning how to work with a team. There was even the chance that working with a team would reduce the odds of Logan going feral simply because he wouldn't be taking all the hits in a fight. Provided, of course, said fight wasn't against Hydra. Scott had been hearing all about Hydra's seeming organization-wide preference for dying at Logan's hands rather than face off against Captain America and the ex-Winter Soldier. Not that Scott particularly blamed them for that decision. Those problems aside, the two teams were able to meld fairly well. By the last two practices with the Sentinel scenario, something resembling true teamwork between the two teams was starting to appear. At that point, various folks started to set each other up for good shots by the big robot, and were starting to get each other in and out of range to tangle with the thing without needing a prompt from Steve or Scott. It'd take a few more practices together before anything more complex than that could be pulled off with a minimum of trouble. After the last practice, Bruce, shirtless and barefoot and in a ridiculously loose pair of sweatpants, Tony, from his grumbling, was still working on something better than that for Bruce, headed to one side of the room while the Avengers settled into a loose semicircle between him and the X-Men. Watching the transformation kind of made Scott want to cringe because that looked like it hurt. Hulk bellowed when he was fully out, but Scott could swear it sounded more eager and happy than pissed off. The big guy certainly paid the X-Men absolutely no mind at first as he bounded over to the Avengers, clearly thrilled to see them. Scott couldn't help but laugh when both Clint and Peter clambered up onto Hulk's shoulders almost as soon as the big guy got in range. Hulk, for his part, altered how he was standing and moving in a clear attempt to make it easier for the two of them to be able to stay aboard. After about 3, maybe 4 minutes, Hulk seemed to be done greeting his team and started looking around. They'd left the cityscape part of the Sentinel scenario running, so the room looked like more than a big black box. That, and they hadn't had the Sentinel smashing competition yet, which all their heavy hitters were still game for, predictably. It took Hulk less than 2 seconds to zero in on the X-Men. Remarkably, he remained calm. He had a distinctly suspicious look on his face, though. Scott knew that if any of them did anything even remotely aggressive or even questionable, they'd deeply regret it. That said, Hulk didn't immediately move to attack them. "Hulk," Steve said, "these are some friends. They like to help smash." From the expression on Hulk's face, that announcement got the X-Men some serious brownie points. Then Steve pointed to each of the X-Men and named them, shortening all of the multiple-syllable code names as he went. Scott stepped forward first to properly meet Hulk, but Hank and Kurt were hot on his heels. "He's probably going to sniff you," Steve said. "Just let him. We're pretty sure scent's his primary way of recognizing things and people." That made sense to Scott, since visual cues would be heavily altered just by the change in height perspective. Heaven only knew what else changed visually between Bruce and Hulk. Same went for sound. Smell, on the other hand, Hulk undoubtedly was able to smell more than Bruce could, but Bruce was fully capable of smelling things that would still be there when Hulk took over, making it much more reliable. Hulk did indeed sniff each of them briefly, and sneezed when he got to Kurt, probably because of the sulfur, and who knew what else, scent that accompanied Kurt's teleportation. He seemed to be utterly fascinated by both Kurt and Hank, picking both men up, very gently poking at them, and making distinct curious sounds. Those two men being who they were, they endured it good-naturedly. At one point, he turned toward the Avengers, pointed at Hank, and asked, "What is?" Scott was both amused and amazed at the simplified explanation the Avengers gave Hulk about mutants. Hulk gave an odd little rumble, but did seem to at least partly understand what he'd been told. "Okay, big guy," Steve said. "It's time for a little fun." That, of course, got Hulk's undivided attention. "The rest of us are going to head down that way." Steve pointed to the opposite end of the street from where the Sentinel appeared. "In a minute or two, a really big thing, bigger even than you, is going to show up there." Steve pointed to the corner where the Sentinel showed up. "When it does, you get to smash it, as good as you can." That got the kind of grin from Hulk that might just make even the Titan reconsider his plans. They all hustled well out of range of the incipient chaos, and once they were clear, the scenario started again.